Hello, so this is still a tutorial to make this kind of game. But before we get to part 5, I forgot to mention one thing. But that's quite useful because it can be used to get into some more detail on some important parts. So we'll have a quick intermission on how to get help in Godot generally. Here's what I forgot to mention in the last video. While we used move and slide for the player character, for the obstacle we just added values to its position and multiplied that by delta, to make sure that we account for the varying frame rates. Now a reasonable question is, why didn't I multiply the value in the move and slide with delta as well? And that would be a pretty good question. And the answer is actually quite simple. Move and slide by itself multiplies it by delta, so we don't need to do it. Whereas obstacle does not multiply it by delta, so we have to do it manually here, whereas move and slide already multiplies velocity by delta on every frame, so there's no point in multiplying it again. Now that being said, you might have another question, and that would be, how can you possibly know which one is multiplied by delta and which one is not multiplied by delta? And that's also a really good question. So just for an overview, if you don't use any function or method, so if you just change position, rotation or size, then delta would never be included. It can only be included if you use a function or a method. And there are actually only really two main methods on a 2D kinematic body to move the node. One is move and slide, and the other is move and collide. Both move a kinematic body, but do it in slightly different ways and have slightly different purposes. And of the two, only move and slide multiplies by delta. Move and collide does not, so you would have to include it. And that would bring us to a third question. And that is, how can you possibly know all of this? And that would still be a really good question. So let's go through how to figure out all of this kind of stuff in Godot. The most direct way is to use the inbuilt help tools in Godot. And that can be done by going to help, and you go to search, or you press Shift F1, whatever works for you. And then you have a list of basically anything that happens in Godot. Most is classes, and a class here just means node. Or it can mean quite a few other things, but mostly it's nodes. But you also have other kinds of properties. So for example, you would have position in here. That would be a property. But what we need right now is to look at a kinematic body 2D. And let me select it. And then we have a very long list of all the information right in our code view, so we can very easily go back to code. And in here, we start at the top with description, and this is a general overview of the node. Then you have some online tutorials, then you have the properties that are unique to it, and then we have the really important part, and that's methods. And in here, we already have seen a couple of them. For example, is on floor down here, or is on wall we have seen in one of the tutorials before. And we also have move and slide in here. And then we have move and collide, and there's a third one I didn't really mention, but it's really similar to move and slide. It just has a snap. And to get more detail on each of them, you just click on whatever is underlined. So if move and slide is underlined, you can click on it, and then you go directly to the page that explains it in detail. And the really important part we need here is that linear velocity is the velocity vector in pixels per second. And it should not be multiplied by delta, unlike move and collide. So if you read this one, it tells you basically what needs a delta and what doesn't need a delta. And yeah, that's pretty much it. The documentation has lots of good stuff. And especially if you start out, you will probably open this one all the time. And it is incredibly useful. And Godot kind of knows that you need it quite often, so there are some shortcuts to use it. So let me go back to the scene. And one way you can open the documentation a little bit faster, you can, for example, right-click on a node, and then you can open documentation. And that's quite a faster way to get to the same point. Or what you can do if you're on code view, so I'd say here I want to know more about move and slide, you can hold Control for Windows or Command on a Mac, and then it underlines it, and if you now click on the method, then you get to the same point we were before. So this tends to make things quite a bit easier. So this is just inside of Godot where you can find information. And that's a really good start and usually where you want to start. But you can also find some information online. And the most immediate way is when you go to godotengine.com, you go to community, and there's quite a few groups that you can ask questions. For example, there's Reddit, there's a Facebook group, there's a Matrix, there's a Discord channel, and there's a couple of other things. But the most immediate one you can use is the question and answer section, where you have all the different questions, and if you post a question here, you will have a human being answering your question. And especially when you're just starting out, this one is really, really useful. So if you have no idea how to do something or you're completely stuck, you can totally ask a question here. If you use those two, you should basically be good to go. There's also Reddit and Stack Overflow, and those also tend to be quite good sources. But if you use the documentation and the Q&A section of the Godot website, you'll probably cover 90% of what you will ever need. And yeah, I hope that helps to clear things up a little bit. And with all of that done, now we can go to the normal part of this tutorial series.